I'm Alfredo Ortiz,
I'm Elaine Parker,
and it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Elaine Parker, the president of the Job Creators Network Foundation.
And I'm Jordan Bruno, vice president at Job Creators Network.
And you can subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcasts from. Today, we are actually joined again by Jonathan Williams. Jonathan is the chief economist and executive vice president of policy at the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, as we like to call it, where he works with state policymakers, congressional leaders, and members of the private sector to develop fiscal policy solutions for the states. He's also the author of Rich States, Poor States, and he's here to talk to us about his annual report that comes out on Rich State, Poor States. Jonathan, welcome to Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone.
Well, thanks so much for having me back again. It's great to join you and talk about some of these just amazing success stories of the states and what's happening in those 50 laboratories of democracy.
Absolutely. We love to hear about things going on at the state levels. Sometimes it gets a little depressing to keep talking about the federal level because not as much movement and successes happen at the federal level, but they sure do happen at those state levels. Well, tell us first about who ALEC is and what you do there, what the mission of the organization is, and then we'll get into the report a little bit more.
Well, ALEC is really a unique organization in that we've been around now 50 years. We just celebrated our 50th anniversary in the fall of 2023, and we were founded as a group of state legislators who believe in really three guiding principles: free markets, limited government, and federalism. I mean, quintessential American principles that our founders placed in the Constitution. Of course, thought they were awfully important for the success of our fledgling nation at the time, and of course, growing into the greatest country in the face of the earth. Those have been principles that have fueled our country, and it's something that we at ALEC, I've been there for 17 years now, believe strongly in that principle-based approach to policymaking, and that idea of federalism is one of those three guiding principles. Like I mentioned, should be that not all good decisions, in fact, most don't happen at the federal level in Washington. They're supposed to happen at the state and local level, and of course, empowering people and business owners themselves to make those individual liberty-based decisions. And one of the other great things about ALEC that makes us unique is we're not just a legislative organization. We believe strongly in the private sector ideas of entrepreneurship and, of course, that free market principle that guides our strong economy and job creation opportunities. And we don't think profit's a dirty word. I know that's something that you guys defend a lot, and we really appreciate the partnership with JCN and your great work over the years. But being able to come forward with sound policy solutions to come up with some of the greatest challenges that face us when it comes to policy, but also business challenges that we can come in and try to make sure that government stays out of the way from those entrepreneurs and job creators across the country.
Yeah, you all do some great work over there, and we do love working with you on different projects. But this new report, Rich States, Poor States, you've been doing this. This is your 17th edition, I think I saw.
Hard to believe it. Yes, it was day one on the job was the idea that we wanted to create a report to rank the states based on economic competitiveness. And Art Laffer, one of my co-authors that you know well, has been doing this for far longer and following the data across state lines. And he and Steve Moore, my other co-author of the report, thought ALEC was a perfect place to publish this and turn it into a book form and an annual basis to give state legislators and the concerned public and job creators across the country a way to measure how their state's doing versus the other 49, and realizing this is a direct competition that states are in. And there's a lot of winners and there's a lot of losers when it comes to that competition, just as in any competition. But that's an inherent part of why America works, is this competition between states. States need to be better to win and succeed and actually create those opportunities for the private sector to create jobs and for individuals to flourish. And it's a beautiful story. It's a very complicated story, and over 17 years, there's lots of ups and downs to talk through. But it's an incredible way, in a nonpartisan, just call it as it is, balls and strikes, why states are doing well in some cases and why other states are not.
what are some of the key things you look at in the methodology in ranking these states?
Well, so we look at 15 equally weighted factors to get to our economic outlook score. And that's the thing that gets the most publicity when we release Rich States, Poor States, is that economic outlook ranking of the states. And those are 15 factors are things like taxes and regulation, labor policy, things we know matter for economic growth. It's something that Dr. Laffer studied for years and has really honed in. I mean, you could probably measure 1,000 things, frankly, but these are some of the 15, I think, the most important based on Dr. Laffer's research over the last 50 years. But a second reason why we chose these 15 factors, I think, just as important, because there's so many good ranking systems out there. And that's an inherently good thing, as we've talked about, that states need to realize and benchmark themselves and where they stack up. But not all are created equally. I mean, we think that Rich States, Poor States is a incredibly powerful tool because these are factors that state lawmakers, the men and women who are putting really so much of their blood, sweat, and tears into what they do in public service in the state capitals. There are things they directly control in a state legislative session. And so, lots of different other ways to rank states, but there's some things that state legislators only wish they could control. Being a Michigan native myself, we would have hoped in January to raise the temperature a few degrees and maybe have, beachfront tourism in Lake Michigan in January. It just doesn't happen, and state legislators in Lansing have no ability to change that as however they might like. But factoring in the things that matter for growth and the things that state legislators can control in a limited period of time. And that's why we see over 17 years so many big changes in the rankings. And we've kept this consistent time series to be able to say, not only where are you at in 2024 for economic outlook, but where have you been? Have you declined? Have you improved, and why?
Great. So, Jonathan, with the new report, tell us your main findings. What are the rich states and what are the poor states?
Well, so I don't know if you have the drum roll here, but we have the top 10 states are an incredibly powerhouse group of states, and all of the 10 states deserve special recognition in really that top tier. Even the top 15, it's very competitive in the top 15. But Utah has been number one for not just this year, last year, and the year before. Each and every edition for the last 17 years, Utah has had the top economic ranking in the country for our economic outlook score. And we could probably spend an entire episode here talking about the virtues of what Utah has done right, what their policymakers have done. They've been really innovative in a lot of ways. But let me just focus on a few, I think, key takeaways and why that's the case. And you'll see commonalities from some of the Utah successes really reverberate throughout the top 10 states. But at the basic level, so many of these states do well because they have been tax-cutting states. They've been states that, in many cases, have flat taxes or avoid a personal income tax altogether. That's obviously a big deal for job creators, as the vast majority of small businesses across the United States don't pay C corporation taxes. They pay taxes on the individual side of the tax code. And so having lots of taxes matter, of course, and every tax that you take a productive dollar out of the private sector and put it into the government sector, you're going to have an economic loss. But that being said, not all taxes are created equally. And so states that have focused on cutting income taxes, and it's been an incredible run this last several years of states cutting taxes, because they're looking at states like Utah, like Idaho, like Arizona, North Carolina, Indiana, our top 5 for economic outlook. And they're saying whatever they're doing there is working in those states. They're some of the fastest growing states in America. Don't just take our word for it, as we always like to say. I mean, the proof is in the pudding. Look at the government data of which states are actually growing. And one of the greatest phenomenons, I think, that's there when it comes to studying why some states succeed and when states don't. And based on the policy choices and that resume a state builds for themselves based on a business climate and overall climate for individual taxpayers, one of the most important takeaways is, are you a state that's growing your population and more people are coming into your state, or are you a state that's a state where people say they're from? And are you at the net in-migration state? You look at the United Van Lines data, you look at U-Haul data, but you look at the U.S. Census that surveys Americans, as we say, they vote with their feet away from states with high taxes and towards states like in our top 5 and top 10 that are perennially the growth states across the country. When you get it right when it comes to free market policy, lower taxes, limited government, smart regulations that don't overburden businesses. These are some of the common traits of the states in the top. I mean, rounding out the top 10, there'll be some other states that won't be a surprise for those of your viewers that follow state policy. But you're looking at number 6 in Texas, powerhouse state, one of those states that have avoided an income tax throughout their state's history. South Dakota, Wyoming, 2 other no income tax states, Oklahoma and North Dakota. So those are the top 10 states. And they have a lot of good traits in common. But one thing that doesn't get nearly enough press and doesn't get nearly enough attention is this difference of budgeting and the difference of way that state legislators approach revenue and expenditures, and that decision where they have to balance a budget in 49 of the 50 states every year, whether it's in the state statute or the state constitution. Now, clearly, balanced budget requirements don't really work in California and states that don't really approach it seriously. But just think of the dichotomy there and juxtapose that way of doing business at the state level versus Washington, D.C., where they haven't even attempted to balance a budget. And I think we've had 3 balanced budgets in the last 40 years, and they happened under Newt Gingrich when he was Speaker of the House. That tells you how long it's been. So that's been, I think, a very healthy thing that doesn't get enough press. But the states that do well to keep taxes low are states that do well by keeping spending in check and keeping it limited.
Interesting. One of the cool things about the report is that everybody can just go on, and the first thing you're going to want to do is look at your state. So everybody has that kind of personal connection. Interesting here, you're from Michigan. I'm actually based in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Been here for a while. And I was surprised to see that Michigan is 16. For a blue state, I felt that was a pretty good ranking. But originally going into this interview, I wanted to ask you the question of, so many states, especially Michigan is maybe Exhibit A, are really bifurcated between a pro-business side of the state and then maybe a bigger side of the state that is pro-government. Even upstate New York has some business, pro-business parts, even inland California, and certainly Michigan's a great example of that as well. Is there any way that your report can take into account this dichotomy, the fact that it gets a terrible score may still have parts of it that are good pro business, or how do you try to overcome that?
Well, that's a great point. There's a lot of regional dynamics, especially within big states. I mean, Michigan, clearly, West Michigan and the Grand Rapids area has done well and has been incredibly resilient, even if policy has been wrong. And, policymakers in Lansing have gotten it wrong in many cases, especially with the repeal of right to work. I think that the effect has not really been felt yet in our ranking and in the way that we see the economic data, since it's just happened a couple of months ago now when it was official in February. But when you look at big states like New York, like California, I mean, clearly when you look at the performance data, states like California and New York still do relatively well versus their outlook score based on the policy factors that we measure. There's always the inherent ability of New York to stay afloat to some degree because of Wall Street and the world's financial center and because of Silicon Valley in California. It's the areas outside of those areas, though, that I think are especially hard hit when policymakers in Albany and Sacramento and Lansing and other state capitals have been getting it wrong where they've been getting it right when they enact those policies. Because I was just in Albany, New York, as we launched our tax day press conference there with members of the New York Assembly. And, the first step to, trying to get out of the number 50 ranking where they're at in the bottom of the index is admitting they have a problem. And I think they're there and saying, hey, how can we fix this? Because when you go to outside of Manhattan, you go to upstate, you go to Western New York, you go to the southern tier in New York, and some of these places have been absolutely hollowed out and decimated because of high taxes and bad policies where, in Manhattan, the financial services industry, by and large, has stuck it out. I mean, Florida's been a huge recipient of a lot of that, but, there's still the center core there that has kept the economic performance in check. Same thing in California. You go to the Central Valley in California versus Silicon Valley, 2 very different states, really, when it comes to the economy. So that's an important piece. I mean, it's difficult to capture in the state-by-state rankings, but there's no doubt that when you get into that granular level of detail, even going to the county by county level, like we see with population changes, there is a really strong story to tell of states that get it right and get it wrong, and what that means at the lower levels outside of the state government.
Interesting. Well, I'm in Florida, so of course I looked at my rankings there. We're at 14, thanks to Governor DeSantis, and of course we're a very crowded state as the recipient of many people fleeing states like New York, particularly during the pandemic. And you mentioned New York is dead last in this report. What are some of the sort of big surprises you saw, either big movements on the improvement side and moving up the list, or big movements moving down the list? Did you see anything that was, remarkable?
Well, there's a few, I think, really interesting case studies, mostly positive upward movements, I think, that deserve mentioning. There is one that, a state that almost broke into the bottom 10 for the very first time, and that was Washington State. And that's been a no income tax state, a state that is generally, for being pretty business unfriendly in many cases, especially in recent years, outside of avoiding an income tax. That's probably the one thing that does keep it out of the bottom 10. But Washington State has fallen in recent years because of so much of this kind of Green New Deal style politics and policy that has come out of Washington State with Governor Inslee and a very left-wing state legislature. You may have noticed, they tried to pull this stunt to say, hey, a capital gains income tax is not an income tax because an income tax is disallowed under their state's constitution. Unfortunately, their state Supreme Court didn't buy the fact of the matter that capital gains income taxes are income taxes as defined by every other state that has an income tax. So they put that on the books. It's deteriorated the state's business climate even more, adding on to the big regulatory push from Governor Inslee and so many other anti-business policies. And at the end of the day, as we all saw, Elaine, one of your fellow state residents now is Jeff Bezos. And Jeff Bezos left Washington State and moved to Florida, kept the no income tax status, but avoided a capital gains income tax. And based on some of the estimates that I've seen, the state of Washington, their budget estimates, their revenue estimates coming off the capital gains income tax will be down by nearly 50% because of that one individual who has picked up, voted with their feet, and gone to a state that taxes less, or in the case of Florida, doesn't tax capital gains income tax at all, like Washington State does. Now, the other piece on the, I think, more optimistic side of the state stories, Texas, the other big red state that's a no income tax state. You take Florida and Texas versus New York and California, a great four-way comparison of just oversimplifying, but looking at America's top four states, and the trends in those states are undisputable when it comes to the correlations of high taxes in New York and California, the outmigration of hundreds of thousands of individuals just in the last 12 months on net. Over the longer term, millions, of course, of Americans are voting with their feet away from New York and California to places like Texas and Florida. Now, Texas had been roughly where Florida had been in the rankings, moved up from 13th to 6th in this edition of Rich States, Poor States, its best ranking ever. Because as many Florida and Texas residents know, property taxes are a challenge in those states, both of those states. And Texas really took the bull by the horns and went in and had a massive tax cut, $18 billion net tax cut, using surplus to remove some of those over-the-top property tax burdens, which had been the one thing that really kept Texas out of that elite tier of states in the Rich States, Poor States ranking in the past. So in one legislative session, moving up 7 spots. Another couple that don't get nearly as much attention, but really should be discussed, are states like Nebraska and Mississippi. Not generally states that you talk about as top 10 states. And in fact, they're still not top 10 states, but they were two of the bigger movers this last year because they moved away from a graduated income tax, a progressive income tax in Mississippi, to a flat tax. They were one of the 5 states in 2022 that became flat tax states. An incredible movement of the largest of any year in American history of states moving away from that anti-business, anti-wealth creation, progressive income tax and towards a flat tax. They moved into the top 20. Now, that may be not something that, that's going to catch the attention of the mainstream media in Washington. It's going to be something that had been one of America's poorest states and still is in many metrics, but it's a state that's begun to turn the ship in the right direction. And I think there's very positive things ahead for states like Mississippi that have followed that route. And then Nebraska, a state that didn't quite get to a flat tax, but had a really dramatic tax reform package that just passed last year that nearly put income tax rates down by 50%, both on personal and corporate income. And Nebraska had been a high tax state, believe it or not. You wouldn't think so as an outside observer. You'd see it very red on the political map, but Nebraska's taxes were far too high, and they took a step in the right direction. So two a little under the radar stories, and one in Texas that should get a whole lot of attention because that's been a huge economic powerhouse for a long time.
Yeah, property taxes are a big deal in Florida. They're just outrageous. And when you couple that with homeowners insurance, it's...
Oh, I've heard the insurance is just terrible. It's not your property tax.
Yeah. The homeowners...
Yeah, property tax is really bad in Michigan as well.
Yeah.
Jonathan, I'd imagine the overlap among the top states and Republican governance is pretty strong. And among the poor states, the overlap between the poor states and Democrat governance is pretty strong. But tell us how strong it is. Like, say, out of the top 10 or top 15 states, what number of those have Republican governors and legislatures?
Well, it's, we look at it strictly from a partisan, from a policy perspective and not from a partisan perspective. But when you look at, it's hard to ignore the question. And, that is a strong correlation of states that have been governed by fiscally conservative legislators and governors for a long time in many cases. If you're looking at the top 10, for instance, right now, I think 9 of the 10 have Republican governors, where North Carolina is the outlier there. And as you know, the story with Governor Cooper, with Republican supermajorities in the North Carolina legislature, they've overridden the vetoes that he's tried to put in the way of many of the big pro-growth reforms. I mean, it deserves to be said, North Carolina has been a historic turnaround story when it comes to the rich states, poor states rankings. You go back to the first edition or the first couple of years of rich states, poor states, and North Carolina was middle of the pack at best. I think they were 26th in one early edition of rich states, poor states, moving all the way up to number 4, one of the biggest turnaround stories. And that happened because Tom Tillis was Speaker of the House. He sat on the ALEC board of directors before he became a United States Senator. And he was one of the first Republican conservative speakers since Reconstruction. My friend Harold Brubaker was the other briefly in the 1990s, but almost an uninterrupted 150 years of liberal control and a tax code that showed its age. And they said, we need to start from scratch. You had Governor Pat McCrory come in, and you had Senate President Phil Berger, and that group really turned around North Carolina. And, fast forward to they lost the governorship, and Governor Cooper has actually, for some of the anti-business things he wanted to do, he actually signed into law a budget several years ago. And many people don't know this, but North Carolina will become in several years the first state that I'm aware of in American history to completely repeal its business income tax, its corporate income tax, and not replace it with something else. And that was a budget sent to him by the Republican legislature that he ended up signing. Maybe he signed it for political necessity. He knew his veto would be overridden. I don't know, but it was signed into law by a Democrat governor, showing that, I think, as I talked to my Democrat friends in other states, you have governors like Jared Polis in Colorado that is calling for the elimination of the personal income tax in Colorado. We'll see if he gets his way. We'll see if it's pure rhetoric or if he's serious about implementing it and what it would mean to replace the revenue with other types of taxes. But I do think it's a positive development that while the top 10 states, 9 of the 10 are currently Republican governors, that Democrats, in some cases, the smart Democrats out there, the pro-business Democrats, realize they have to be sensible when it comes to taxes. And they realize that tax policy can be a tool for economic development to enhance revenue at the end of the day. I mean, that's the Laffer curve. You lower taxes and you become more competitive, and you don't have to raise tax rates to get more revenue. You can raise more taxpayers to get more revenue. And that's been one of the big success stories of Texas and Florida, obviously, with the in-migration effect and how they've been able to stay ahead of paying for government services like roads and other things that are essentials, is they haven't raised an income tax, but they have so many more taxpayers coming into their state, paying the sales tax, paying those property taxes, everything else that funds government services. So it's kind of an interesting story. It's good to see bipartisan approval of tax cuts, and I hope that continues. I mean, I think that's very healthy for a two-party system to realize that one party needs to also be in the game when it comes to economic development.
Jonathan, what kind of impact, well, as you know, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is due to expire fully at the end of 2025. Parts of it have already started to expire. But one of the provisions in it was the elimination of the SALT deduction, which obviously benefited, wealthy, coastal elites in the Northeast and the West in California. What kind of impact have you seen as a result of the elimination of SALT? And I know there's a push from Democrats in Congress to bring that back.
I'm glad you asked the question. I was just giving a talk to the State Financial Officers Foundation here for the state treasurers earlier this week, and that topic came up. And I think it's such an important topic. Obviously, it's not getting the attention right now in Washington that it deserves, and it's certainly not getting the attention of the connectivity between what is happening at the federal level and what that would mean for states and state budgets, and of course, taxpayers most importantly. But all of those individual provisions of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act will go away at the end of next year if nothing's done. And I think it's a pretty good bet given the just chaos in Washington right now, in politics anyways, and what's going on with government decisions, and that, it's a pretty good bet that something is not going to happen, at least this year. Maybe if we have a different set of leaders coming in 2025, they'll be able to pull it together just in time to, I think, stave off what would be a calamitous outcome for the American economy and for individual taxpayers, is having all of those individual side tax cuts go away. That's the child care tax credit. That's the lower rates on both individual pass-through income for small businesses and individuals. I mean, so many of those pro-growth things that help lift the economy for those years during the Trump administration, where we saw record low unemployment rates, record high growth in many areas of the economy. And by the way, when we had inflation down in the 1% range versus just this horrible stagflation that we're stuck in right now because of the big government agenda with the Biden administration. Then you get to the SALT issue, which is really, really an important one, and one that's misunderstood, unfortunately, I think by many. It's one that we at ALEC spent a lot of time educating on back in 2017, because there were groups coming to Washington saying that if we limit the SALT deduction, that's the deduction of state and local taxes, that previous to 2017, you could take an unlimited amount of state and local taxes and write it off your federal tax bill. Now, that may sound pro-taxpayer, but of course what it was, is to your point, Elaine, exactly right, a subsidy to those big government states that have high tax burdens at the state and local level. And the benefits accrued to a very small percentage of very wealthy individuals in those big government states. And so when it was limited to $10,000 as part of that compromise in 2017, I think the right SALT policy is to not have a deductibility of state and local taxes and let states rise and fall on their own merits and deal with it when it comes to taxpayers being upset. Go have a tax revolt at the state capitol and say taxes are too high in Albany and in Sacramento and in Trenton and in Springfield, Illinois. Don't come to Washington and ask the well-governed states to bail you out and basically have that subsidy for big government policies. Now, I will say, we in rich states, poor states, coming out of 2017 and that tax cut and the SALT limitation, we projected there would be an upward amount of interstate migration. And we were exactly right. We saw what had been a long time phenomenon of people leaving high tax states, going to low tax states like we talked about. But we saw the numbers enhanced because they could no longer write off the taxes. I mean, it was a big jolt of extra tax burden to those taxpayers in the high tax states, what gave them one more reason to flee and go to a no income tax state or a state that had lower taxes altogether. And the other thing that it did from a political economy perspective, which I thought was just remarkable, and many people missed this headline, but even in New Jersey, not a state that's had a lot of pro-taxpayer sentiment recently in the state legislative body, and not since Governor Chris Christie served as governor have you had one that respected taxpayers, I don't think. But you saw what happened post 2017 in that federal tax reform, when that SALT deduction was no longer unlimited. You actually had at the time the Democrat Senate President, Steve Sweeney of New Jersey, say we cannot raise taxes more because our people are already paying more and we can't write it off anymore on our federal return. That's exactly the kind of behavior shift that was meant by this limiting the SALT deduction. And that's something that didn't get nearly enough attention, once again, in the mainstream media in Washington, but it was something that shifted the dynamics at the state level. If it can break through a state like New Jersey with the diehard pro-tax economic policies that they've had to say, let's rethink our way of doing business, that tells you how powerful of a policy it was.
Well, I think if we still have very divided government after the election, I would suspect that will be something, if they have an appetite for trying to save the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, I suspect that will be something that the Democrats will be negotiating to get back in the.
I think that's a safe bet, and there are some Republicans from the Northeast that say, hey, this is something that's going to be politically hard for us to vote for to keep a limit. But, the other side has the issue in spades because, anybody that's intellectually honest that says a tax cut for the rich is an evil thing, like the Bernie Sanders wing and the AOC wing of the Democrats right now, they have to look at themselves in the mirror and say, why are you saving a tax provision that only benefits the wealthy individuals in high tax states, more or less? The vast majority of the benefits go to those individuals. And so for all the class warfare we hear and big government policies and tax the rich, the billionaires aren't paying their fair share, you'd have a good chunk of Democrats being put in a very difficult vote to say, do you want to have this benefit for very wealthy individuals in those states? It's not an easy one for their side either.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I was wondering if you can let our audience know where they can go to learn more about ALEC and download your report, Rich States, Poor States.
Sure. ALEC.org is a great resource across all of the different economic policy areas we cover, everything from international relations to health and human services and all the policies that matter at the state level. But also richstatespoorstates.org is an incredible website. We have a microsite there set up where you can see not only where you rank this year as your state, but where you've ranked all of the last 17 years and say, how is the progress or lack of progress been. And one other tool that we use that I think is worth pointing out is we have a way for you as a concerned citizen, as a business owner, as a policymaker to go to richstatespoorstates.org and play around with your policy environment in your state. And you could actually see in real time how that would change your Rich States, Poor States economic outlook ranking. You say, hey, what if we made Michigan a right to work state again? What if we eliminated the income tax in Kansas? All those great ideas that people may have, you can see how much it actually moves the needle.
Well, great. Well, 17th edition, ALEC.org or richstatespoorstates.org. You all can download the report. Are you going to have a celebration on your 20th edition?
We're planning it. Yes, we'll love to do something with you guys as well. I mean, it's going to be a big year, and it's who knows? Maybe Utah will be at number one for all 20 and complete the sweep of the 2 decades. So time will tell.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. I guess you'd probably be celebrating out in Utah then, right?
I think that's probably a good bet.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Well, Jonathan, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us on Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. And thank you to you all for taking the time to listen. Main Street Matters is part of the Salem Podcast Network. New episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday. Please subscribe to SalemPodcastNetwork.com or wherever you get your podcasts from, and we'll be back soon with another new episode.